Hi everyone, welcome to my presentation on the Special Education Evaluation and Individualized Education Plan process for students in public schools in the United States. This is a really brief overview, but it will give you a foundation as we move forward in thinking about issues related to English language learners and when they're having difficulty learning and whether or not we feel they should go for an evaluation for special education services, or if we need to do more intensive interventions through an RTI model, which we'll learn about later on in the semester. RTI stands for Response to Intervention. In Pennsylvania, we call it RTII, which is Response to Instruction and Intervention. And again, we'll be talking about this later on in the semester. So I just want to point out to you the flowchart. This is from the PATAN website. PATAN is a resource that's used by people who want to know more about Pennsylvania Department of Education policy, so they develop a lot of great materials. So we're going to use their flowchart here. So I'm going to take my mouse and I'm going to use it on the cursor of the flowchart, and I'll walk you through the stages, okay? In terms of when a child is struggling, and they've been struggling for a long period of time, and we've tried all kinds of interventions with them, and nothing seems to really be working satisfactorily. We start with here, this circle right here, where the LEA, which is the local education agency, or the school district, requests permission to evaluate. They request permission from the student's parent. If the parent does not give written permission to evaluate the student using a psychoeducational evaluation, then there's no way the school district can move ahead with the evaluation. So the school district then issues this form, the Permission to Evaluate Consent Form, okay, and the procedural safeguards are is a document that has all of the rights that parents have in relation to the special education process for their son or daughter. Okay, so they issue the permission to evaluate to the parent. Okay, and then we write that, did the parents give permission? Again, they have to give permission, or else the school district cannot evaluate the child. So if it's no, if the parents don't give permission, the district can pursue litigation or legal recourse. Okay, but it's not required, and few districts will push it if the parent really doesn't want the child to be evaluated. Okay, if they do go to mediation or legal due process, there's a hearing officer who's involved, and sometimes if the hearing officer agrees with the district, then they order the evaluation themselves. So here, so if the school district decides to go to legal mitigation, and the hearing officer decides that the district should move forward with evaluation, okay, then the decision making goes to the next step in the evaluation process. If the district does pursue legal action, but the evaluation is not ordered by the hearing officer, then we go to the end of the cycle. Okay, the student is not evaluated, there's no more discussion about evaluating the student moving forward unless at a later date the school decide and the parent decide to evaluate the child. Okay, but it all is contingent on this, did the parents get permission? Okay, so let's say the parents do get permission, okay, written permission, a signature. Okay, then we move into the evaluation. So who conducts that? The school psychologist. And part of the evaluation includes IQ tests and achievement tests. They also collect all the information they can on curriculum assessments like unit tests or other sorts of computer tests, or those of you who are in schools who use Ames, Web, or DIVLs. All of that information, report card grades, PSSA results, Keystone exam results, all of that goes into the evaluation. Okay, and then the school psychologist determines if the student is eligible for special education services according to the criteria that we use as part of education law. Specific education law is Individuals with Disabilities Educational Improvement Act, and I'll get to that in a little bit. Okay? The school psychologist decides if the student's eligible based on their entire evaluation. If the student's not eligible, then they send home what's called a NORREP, or Notice of Recommended Educational Placement, to the parents saying that the child did not qualify for services. Okay? If the school psychologist does feel that the student is eligible, then the parents are invited to a meeting with the school personnel. That's called an IEP meeting, or a meeting where the school personnel and the parent come up with the individualized education plan and educational supports for the student according to their area of need based on their disability. Okay? They develop the IEP, and then the school psychologist issues the notice of recommended educational placement, which outlines the services that the child's entitled to as part of their special education services. Okay, at the end of it all, the parents have to sign that they agree with the IEP and the discussion that ensued. Okay, if they disagree, then no special education services are provided, unless, again, parents can pursue mediation, legal mediation, and there are other things that could happen afterward. But in terms of the special education evaluation process, if the parents at the end of it all don't agree, then they don't move forward with the special ed services. If the parents do agree, then they implement the IEP. It's an annual IEP, so they come back in a year to check out the goals and see if there are any updates. Okay? We're going to move here to a similar flow chart, but this one is a parent-initiated request. So whenever a parent initiates a written request for their child to be evaluated for special education services, school districts have 60 calendar days in which to do the evaluation by law. So it starts similarly, although on this flow chart, the parent is the one who is asking for the evaluation for special education. The request must be in writing. Okay, if it's not in writing, then the school psychologist will issue the permission to evaluate and get the signature of the parent. Okay, if the request is in writing, okay, does the district agree with the request? If the district doesn't agree, then they send home the NOR rep, which says, we're disagreeing with the need to evaluate your child for special education services. If, after the parent requests in writing that their child is evaluated, and the school district agrees with that, okay, then we go to the process where, again, from the other slide, here I'll go back to it, that then the evaluation is conducted, and then this whole section of the flow chart happens, okay, right here. And then, we decide if the child's eligible for special education services or not. So let's move into a little bit about the IQ testing and the achievement testing that happens in relation to a part of these evaluations, because it has a lot of repercussions for English language learners that we're going to talk a lot more about later on in the semester. But I want to give you a little bit, again, of a foundation so you have the background that you need to, as we move forward. Okay, so here we have the bell curve. Some of you may already be very familiar with this from past educational research courses or just in general in terms of talking about norm-based testing. Basically, the theory behind the bell curve here is that on any given trait, whether it be intelligence or height or, foot size, almost anything, that in general, an entire population will fall along this curve in terms of what's normal and the range of what is normal, considering those particular traits. So when it comes to IQ, the theory is that, and all of the IQ tests are designed so that about 68% of the population, this part in blue here, okay, will have an IQ somewhere between 85 and 115. 100 is the mean IQ, or the average IQ as we call it. Okay? Once you get past that, okay, you get into the next, what we call standard deviation, or measure of difference. Okay? So between 115 and 130 IQ, you're going to only have about 14% of the population fall within that range of IQ. Okay, when you get above 130, only about 2% of the population will have an IQ that's between 130 and 145, and a very small percentage of the population will have an IQ score that's above 145. It also works toward the other side. So, again, you have 68% of the population that will have an IQ between 85 and 115. That's considered average. Okay, 14% of the population will have an IQ between 85 and 70. Another 2% will be at the third standard deviation, or measure of variance from this particular mean here. Okay, and we'll have an IQ score that's between 70 and 55, which is very low. And then about 0.1% of the population will have an IQ that's well below 55, which would be a significant intellectual impairment. Okay? All right, so let's move into IQ scores and what they mean. The mean or average IQ, as I said before, is 100. The standard deviation or measure of difference between from 100 to the next level is a 15-point increment. Okay, so if we go back to this slide, okay, between 100 and 115 is 15 points. Okay, so you can vary within this standard deviation or this measure of difference here. But we wouldn't expect a score on an achievement test. Let me go back for a minute. If your IQ is 100, okay, when you take an achievement test, or how well you do in your learning and understanding of concepts, the tests are correlated so that we would expect, if you have an IQ of 100, that you would perform somewhere in a 15-point range or so in relation to your achievement test score. So say your IQ is 100, we'd expect your achievement test in, say, reading to come out at about anywhere between, anywhere within a 15-point difference, so somewhere between 115 and 85. Anything below that 15-point difference, you're considered to have a learning disability, because how you're achieving is very different than what we'd expect from given your IQ. Okay, that's called the IQ achievement discrepancy. That means you're achieving below what we would expect given your IQ. On the top end of things, if you have an IQ, let's say, of 115, but your reading achievement test or your math achievement test gives you a score, say, in the 90s, that's a 15-point difference as well. So anything over a 15-point difference with lowered achievement in comparison to IQ is an early indication of potentially having a learning disability. However, there are lots of things that go into achievement tests and IQ tests. And keep in mind that those tests are in English. And so for English language learners, the tests become more of an English language proficiency test than they do a test of IQ or a test of achievement. So that's why there's a lot of difficulty discerning with an English language learner if their difficulties stem from an organic learning disability that the child has, or if it is a language proficiency issue or an instructional issue. So say they haven't had instruction in reading, or that they, maybe they're refugees and they haven't been able to be in school, and so they haven't had the opportunity to learn. So at that point, we cannot say that the child has a learning disability if they haven't had the chance to be taught and to learn. So there's all these factors that go into looking at these sorts of tests and making decisions about special education evaluation and eligibility. Okay, let's go back to the IQ scores. Typically, giftedness is determined in part, not in total, but in part by having an IQ of 130 or above. Okay, because you're 2 levels of difference away from the average. An intellectual disability, we used to call it mental retardation, now we call it intellectual disability, is typically associated with an IQ below 70, or below 2 standard deviations away from the mean on the bell curve. Okay? To determine intellectual disability, they also must have severe impairments in life skills or in the everyday tasks that people are involved in to go to work or to be at home, to keep a home independently, those sorts of things. Okay? So, norm-based testing and ELLs. Norm-based tests include formal standardized tests of achievement, IQ, and behavior. Most are in English, okay, and are based on very specific cultural and experiential assumptions. Okay, there is no such thing as a culture-free test. Okay, they're all based in particular assumptions about how people learn and what's important to know. Most of these tests are not constructed with English language learners as part of the design. Okay, so if they're not part of the design, then it's really hard to hold the scores as valid for English language learners. Okay, and again, they often turn into English language proficiency tests in the sense that the tests are in English, and English language learners, by definition, struggle with or have lower English proficiency than their non-English language learner peers. Okay. Also, in terms of special education, we always need to be aware of cultural implications, and we're going to talk a lot more about this in the semester as we go along as well. But just again, as a foundation, disability is a socially constructed idea. Okay, in IDEA, which is our current special education law for children in schools ages 0 to 21, okay, it's the Individuals with Disabilities Educational Improvement Act. Okay, and that has as its cultural foundation or its assumptions about disability. What's embedded in that is this idea that everyone has a right to an education, that the focus for all educational programming is the individual, right? Individualized education plan. We look at person-centered planning, or what the actual individual decides that they would like to do or what they need as supports. In transition from school to adulthood, in IDEA, the ultimate goal is independence. Okay, we're looking for children and students to develop the independence to live on their own. And these core concepts of self-advocacy, individual rights, and self-determination are embedded into the law and how we construct the IEP and evaluate students moving forward. Alternate cultural views include the concept of self, whereby individual identities are embedded in the group. That's collectivism. Some of you who've taken ED 625 might have a better understanding of collectivism. We'll talk a little bit about that this semester, but not as much. So if you want to check it out, I think you'll be intrigued. Go ahead and search, do an internet search for individualism versus collectivism, and I think you'll find some really fascinating information. Okay, and another alternate cultural view is that parents, not children, should decide what's best for their child, even into adulthood. Okay. Here's some other cultural constructions of disability related to equity or fairness and choice. Okay, in our mainstream U.S. culture and schools, you have this idea that everyone has a right to an education, zero reject. If they're here, we educate them, no matter who they are or the skills that they come with. Okay, we're supposed to have a non-discriminatory evaluation. Parent participation is valued. All people have the right to have the goal of upward mobility in society. That the least restrictive environment is a major consideration in terms of where a child receives services. Okay, we start with the general education environment first, and move to more restrictive placements only if the child needs those to learn. Okay, and this idea of self-determination, that children have a right to decide for themselves what's best for them. Okay. Alternate cultural views are that social roles and duties are dictated to the individual by the status of the family or group. Outcomes for children with disabilities should be different than for children without disabilities. Children are not provided choice, and there may be gender-based identity issues that come up in relation to differences of thought in terms of what's appropriate in relation to males in the family or boys in the family, sons and daughters. And lastly, Here's some in relation to this medical model of disability. In our mainstream culture, we have this very medicalized idea of disability, that it's diagnosed, we can treat it, and then students can move on. Whereas in other cultures, you know, there's multiple views of a child's ability. Disability could be a spiritual condition. It could be a reflection on a former life. It could be it's lifelong, but there's no need to sort of fix it. That's just what this, you know, who the child is. In many cultures, the idea of disability, the term disability doesn't exist because they accept people for who they are and what they come with, and it's not a sort of fix-it model like we have in the United States. Okay, so this is just a quick beginning, again, of foundations of special education and some foundational issues in relation to English language learners, and thinking about differences between struggling ELLs and why they're struggling. And as we move on in the semester, we're going to be looking at what are some of the things that we need to do before we can feel confident moving forward with a special education evaluation. Because once if a child is diagnosed with a disability, then that sets up a whole different trajectory in terms of their education and their learning and their school outcomes. Okay, so thanks for hanging in there with me in this presentation, and if you have any questions, feel free to email or call. Okay, thanks everybody.